My father removed me from his will because I don't like my new mother, but when I received $12 million, he demanded money from me, citing financial problems. I don't think anyone ever dreams of a childhood like mine. To me, family was supposed to mean safety, love, and warmth. But those were things I only saw on TV or heard other kids talk about. When my father, Luke, remarried Rose, I thought maybe things would finally get better. I was wrong. Luke was distant. I don't know if he was always that way or if it happened slowly over time, but by the time I was old enough to notice, he was more like a roommate who drifted in and out of my life than an actual dad. He was constantly busy, always fussing over the house, or more likely over Rose and her daughter, Brianna, who to him, could do no wrong. It felt like I was the extra in a play where I was meant to be the main character. But instead, I was the outsider, the one person who never quite fit. From the start, Rose didn't try to hide her feelings about me. She acted like my very existence was a problem she had to deal with and not in some subtle, I'm the woman of the house way. No. She was obvious, loud, and relentless about it. There was this disgust in her eyes whenever she looked at me, like I'd interrupted her perfect life just by being around. She wasn't shy about her opinions either. Every little thing I did was wrong, and she made sure I knew it. James, why can't you be more like Brianna? She'd sneer, crossing her arms and shaking her head at me over the dinner table where every meal was a test I seemed to fail. Brianna, of course, was the golden child. She was Rose's daughter from her first marriage. And though she was just a year older than me, she had this quiet confidence that made everyone love her, or at least that's how it seemed to me. Brianna wasn't mean to me outright, but she didn't make it easier either. She watched me the way her mom did with this smug indifference, like she knew I'd never be part of their world. I felt so alone in that house. My dad, Luke, seemed to lose his voice whenever Rose was around. He'd smile and nod at her. His eyes soft with this strange mixture of adoration and fear. It was like he'd forgotten I existed most of the time, only acknowledging me when Rose or Brianna wasn't around. The few times I did ask him why he let Rose treat me the way she did, his responses were evasive, like he was too tired to even think about it. James, she's just strict. She wants the best for you. He'd say in that empty tone, not even looking at me as he spoke. I stopped asking him after a while, but it wasn't just words. Rose wasn't afraid to make sure I stayed in my place. I remember one time, I'd come home from school with a report card that wasn't perfect, mostly B's with a couple of A's. I thought I'd done well, considering how I had to sneak in study time with all the chores Rose assigned me. But as soon as I handed it to her, I knew it wouldn't be enough. This is what you call effort, she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. She crumpled the paper in her hand, throwing it back at me. James, why can't you be like Brianna? Do you see this? She pulled out Brianna's report card from the table drawer, showing off a perfect row of A's as if it were a piece of art. I wanted to yell, to tell her how unfair she was being, how much harder it was for me. But when I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat, and all that came out was a weak, "I'm trying." She shook her head and muttered, "Try harder," before ordering me off to my room. And Leon? He just watched. He always just watched, a small sad smile on his face as if he was sorry but too afraid to say anything. I'd sit in my room, sometimes for hours, just staring at the walls, feeling like I was sinking into the floorboards. Those walls were the only things that heard my voice. The only things that seemed to hold my pain. They didn't judge. They didn't ignore. And they didn't make me feel like I was a mistake. There comes a point when you just can't take any more. And for me, that moment came one night after an argument that left me shaking. I was 17 weeks away from graduation, and I'd stayed up late finishing a school project. Rose had stumbled in late from some work gathering or whatever. Reeking of alcohol, she took one look at me, slouched over my books at the kitchen table and sneered, "What? You think you're gonna get somewhere with that nonsense? Who do you think you are?" Something in me snapped that night. I didn't even respond. I just went to my room, shut the door, and sat there in the darkness, my head buzzing with one thought. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house before it swallowed me whole. The next morning, I walked to school feeling different, like a door had opened that I hadn't noticed before. My best friend, Sarah, noticed it too. Sarah was a quiet, steady presence in my life. Someone who didn't pry but was always there when I needed her. She'd known about my family situation for years. And while I'd never told her everything, she understood enough. That morning, she looked at me with a mixture of worry and relief when I told her, "I'm leaving. I can't stay there anymore." Sarah nodded, not saying a word, just holding my hand. It felt like the first time someone had truly been on my side. That evening, I packed a bag with a few clothes, some cash I'd saved from tutoring sessions, and my favorite books. Pieces of comfort I wasn't willing to leave behind. I didn't tell Leon or Rose. I didn't want their voices in my head. Didn't want them dragging me down just as I was getting up the courage to break free. But, of course, things weren't that simple. Leon noticed the bag the moment he saw me in the hallway. He stood there, his gaze flicking between my face and the duffel bag as if trying to process what was happening. "James, what are you doing?" His voice was thin, wavering, but not with the fear I'd expected. There was a strange calmness there as if he'd known this was coming. "I'm leaving, Dad. I can't live here anymore." The words came out stronger than I'd imagined. A force I didn't know I had in me. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. Then he laughed. A soft, bitter sound. "And where do you think you'll go? You don't have anything, James. This world isn't kind to boys like you. I'd rather face whatever's out there than stay here," I said, not backing down. He sighed, shaking his head as if I was a child throwing a tantrum. "You'll be back," he muttered, turning away. I slipped out before Rose came home, the weight of his words trailing behind me. I didn't know what would happen, where I'd go, or who I'd turn to, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The first few nights, I crashed on Sarah's couch. Her family knew me well enough, and her mom offered to let me stay for as long as I needed. It was tempting, but I didn't want to burden them. I needed to stand on my own. One afternoon, as I was scanning job boards at the local library, I met someone who would change everything. Her name was Maria, a bright-eyed woman in her early 30s who ran a local coffee shop. She noticed me staring at the job postings on the community board and came over, handing me a flyer. "We're looking for help at the shop. Interested?" I looked down at the flyer, the words barista needed, staring back at me. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I nodded, and by the end of the week, I was clocking in my first shift. Maria quickly became more than a boss. She was like the sister I'd never had. A mentor who seemed to understand what I was going through without me saying a word. She'd been through her own battles, and there was a strength in her that I admired deeply. She'd give me extra shifts when I needed them, slip me a sandwich when she thought I looked tired. And once, when she caught me crying in the break room, she just sat with me, her hand on my shoulder. Living independently was harder than I'd imagined. Rent, food, and bills piled up, and I found myself stretching every dollar. But for the first time, I felt like my life was mine, not a puppet show controlled by Rose and Luke. Every time I felt like giving up, I'd think about them and remember why I'd left. The thought of going back kept me going. One day, out of nowhere, Luke showed up at the coffee shop. He looked out of place among the cheerful decor and the smell of fresh coffee, his face tense and drawn. Maria was at the counter, and I was in the back when she called me over. "James, someone's here to see you," she said, her voice careful as if she could sense the tension. I walked out, my heart racing. Luke looked me up and down, his gaze cold and assessing. "James, you've made your point. Now come home." I took a deep breath, standing my ground. "I'm not going back, Dad. I'm happy here." He laughed. A sharp, hollow sound. "Happy living like this? You're wasting your life, James. You don't have a future here." Maria, who'd been quietly observing from the counter, stepped in. "Excuse me, sir, but James A. has a job and a place here. He's doing just fine." Luke's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might scream. But instead, he just shook his head, looking at me with a strange sadness. "You'll regret this," he whispered before walking out the door. It took me hours to shake off his words. Maria was a steady presence, reminding me that I'd made a choice and that I had every right to build my own life. Still, Luke's visit left me rattled. As time went on, I began to find my rhythm. I saved up enough for a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, barely enough room for a bed and a table, but it was mine. Maria helped me move in, and we spent the night painting the walls a cheerful yellow, laughing and talking like we'd known each other forever. Despite the challenges, I finally felt free. The fear and shame that had followed me for years started to fade, replaced by a quiet pride. I wasn't just surviving. I was building something for myself. But the past has a way of finding you. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, Rose showed up. She hadn't aged well. Her face was harsher. Her eyes colder than I remembered. She didn't say a word. Just stood there, staring at me with that same contempt she'd always had. "What do you want?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. She shrugged, glancing around the shop as if it disgusted her. "Luke's been worried. Thought I'd come check on you." I knew it was a lie. Luke wasn't worried about me. He never had been. "I'm fine. You can go now." She took a step closer, her voice dropping. "You think you're better than us now? Living here, working in this dump?" I felt my anger rise, but I kept my voice calm. "Maybe I am, Rose. Maybe I'm finally where I belong." She snorted, shaking her head. "You'll always be a disappointment, James." But for the first time, her words didn't hurt. They didn't mean anything. I just watched her leave feeling a strange sense of closure. I'd escaped, built a life for myself, and no one could take that away from me. I knew deep down that Rose had never thought of me as part of her family. But hearing it spelled out, seeing the proof right there in black and white, was something else entirely. I learned about the will almost by accident, but once I did, I couldn't unhear the words, couldn't unsee the papers that effectively erased me from any place I might have held in his life. It started with a phone call, a voice I didn't recognize saying, "James? This is Martin Hale, the family attorney. We need you to come in for a reading of your stepmom's will." The words sent a shiver through me. I hadn't seen Rose or Luke in years by then, not since that final confrontation in the coffee shop, but I knew things hadn't been great at home. Sarah, my best friend, still lived in the area, and she kept me updated every now and then. Rose's health had been deteriorating, and Brianna was taking on more responsibilities with the family's affairs. The younger daughter, Daniela, whom Rose had with Luke after I left, was already grown up now and had just started college. Apparently, Luke doted on her in the way he never had with me. I showed up at the law office on a rainy Wednesday morning, my heart pounding as I entered the building. The receptionist directed me to a small conference room where Luke, Brianna, and a few others were already seated. Luke looked up when I walked in, his eyes widening in surprise before quickly narrowing. He didn't say anything, just turned back to the papers in front of him. But the air between us was thick with tension. Brianna barely acknowledged me. She was seated next to a woman I didn't recognize, a young, sharply dressed attorney named Rebecca Lang. Rebecca glanced at me, her face expressionless, then continued flipping through her stack of documents. When Martin Hale finally arrived, he didn't waste any time. He took a seat at the head of the table, adjusted his glasses, and began reading from the will. I sat there, hands clenched in my lap as he listed Rose's various assets, her investments, properties, bank accounts. It was more than I'd realized. All of it sounded so far removed from my life, like he was reading off a shopping list for someone else's family. Then Martin paused, looking around the room before he continued. "To my daughters, Brianna and Daniela, I leave the entirety of my estate to be divided equally between them. This includes all properties, financial accounts, and any remaining personal assets." I waited, holding my breath, waiting to hear my name. But it didn't come. The silence stretched on. And when I finally looked up, I saw Luke watching me with a satisfied look as if this had been the final move in a game he'd been waiting to win. That's it. I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. Martin gave me a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, James. Rose didn't leave any provisions for you in her will." The words felt like a punch to the gut. I sat there staring down at my hands, feeling a strange numb emptiness. It wasn't about the money. I'd made a life for myself without their help. But this was a final confirmation, a rejection that hit me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'd always known I was an outsider, but hearing it made official was something else entirely. After the meeting, as people were filing out, Rebecca, the attorney I'd noticed earlier, came over and quietly handed me her card. "If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out," she said, her voice low and calm. There was something in her tone, a flicker of empathy that I wasn't expecting. I took the card, nodding, too stunned to say much else. I left the law office in a daze, the rain pounding down around me. Sarah called that evening and I told her everything. The words tumbling out before I could stop myself. She listened silent and steady, letting me pour it all out until I was hoarse. "They've always treated you like this, James. This doesn't change who you are," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it feels like, I don't know, like I was never really there." I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You were there," she insisted. "You've just built something better for yourself, and they don't know how to handle that." Over the next few weeks, I tried to put it behind me. I buried myself in work, in the life I'd built, trying to ignore the ache that lingered. But it seemed like no matter where I went, I couldn't escape it. One night, Maria, my boss at the coffee shop, found me sitting in the break room, staring off into space. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, sitting down across from me. I shook my head, unable to find the words. But Maria didn't push. She just sat there with me, her hand resting on mine. A silent presence that reminded me I wasn't alone. It was around this time that Rebecca, the attorney, reached out to me again. She'd left a voicemail saying she had some information that might be relevant to me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I didn't care, but curiosity won out. I called her back and agreed to meet. We met at a small cafe where Rebecca laid out a few documents in front of me. "I did some digging," she said, her voice careful. "Rose didn't mention you in the will, but there were some unusual discrepancies in her financial records. I thought you might want to know." My heart pounded as she explained that Rose had set up several funds in Brianna and Daniela's names over the years, transferring large sums of money out of her personal accounts. It wasn't illegal, but it felt like another slap in the face. A reminder that she'd always planned for them, always put them first. While I'd been left to fend for myself, Rebecca looked at me, her expression softening. "I know this is a lot to process, but if you ever need help or even just someone to talk to, I'm here." That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The weight of everything pressing down on me, the will, the rejection, the years of feeling like an outsider, it all felt like too much. I thought about calling Luke, confronting him, demanding answers, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing a therapist, someone Maria recommended. Dr. Green was a calm, kind woman with a gentle voice who helped me start to untangle the web of emotions I'd been carrying for years. In our sessions, I began to see that my family's rejection didn't define me, that their decision to exclude me was a reflection of them, not me. One day, while going through old photos, I found one of myself as a little boy smiling at the camera with a spark of joy in my eyes. Looking at that picture, I felt a surge of protectiveness. That boy deserved better, and it was up to me to give him the life he should have had. The will, the exclusion, the years of feeling like I didn't belong. All of it was painful, but it didn't have to control me. I built a life for myself. One filled with people who cared, who saw me for who I was. And that was something Rose could never take away. The call that changed my life came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was wiping down tables at the cafe, getting ready to close up, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, with a faint British accent. "Hello. Is this James Walker?" the man asked. "Yes. Speaking," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. "My name is Andrew Thompson. I'm calling on behalf of the law firm representing the estate of your late aunt, Mary Benson. Do you have a moment to speak?" I froze. Aunt Mary? I'd only met her a handful of times as a kid. She'd been my father's older sister, a mysterious woman who lived halfway across the country. My memories of her were fuzzy. Mostly images of a tall woman with an air of elegance and independence, always dressed in bold colors, always moving around with a purpose. She was one of those people you'd never forget, even if you didn't know them well. "Yes, I remember her," I said slowly, trying to process what he'd said. "But why are you calling me?" Andrew paused before responding. "Your Aunt Mary passed away a few months ago, and in her will, she named you as one of her beneficiaries. I'd like to set up a time for you to come to our office and discuss the details." Beneficiary. The word hung in the air as unreal as if he'd told me I'd won the lottery. I stammered out a response, agreeing to meet him at the law firm the next day. That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing. Aunt Mary's death was a shock, but the idea that she'd left me anything was almost impossible to grasp. We hadn't been close. She was more like a distant legend in my family. What could she possibly have left me? The next morning, I arrived at the law firm early, my nerves buzzing. The office was located in an elegant old building downtown, the kind of place I'd never imagined myself stepping into. Andrew Thompson met me in the lobby, a tall man in a sharp suit with a serious but kind face. He led me to a small conference room where he handed me a thick envelope. "These are the details of your aunt's estate," he explained, watching me carefully. "I understand this may come as a shock, but Mrs. Benson's assets amount to approximately $12 million. She left all of it to you." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. $12 million? My hands trembled as I held the envelope. My mind reeling. It felt like the universe had flipped upside down. Like reality itself had bent into something unrecognizable. Are you sure?" I whispered, barely able to find my voice. Andrew nodded, his expression gentle. "Mrs. Benson was very clear in her wishes. She wanted you to have the entirety of her estate." I sat there, stunned as he went over the details. Aunt Mary had left me her mansion, a sprawling estate in Connecticut, along with various investments and accounts. The wealth was overwhelming, a sum I couldn't even comprehend. I'd spent my life scraping by, counting every penny, and now, suddenly, I was a millionaire. As I left the office, clutching the envelope to my chest, I felt like I was walking in a dream. The air outside was crisp, the city bustling around me, but everything felt distant, like I was floating above it all. I couldn't believe it. I'd gone from struggling to make ends meet to having more money than I could ever need. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch, staring at the envelope, the shock slowly turning into a kind of giddy disbelief. I called Sarah, my voice shaking as I told her the news. She was silent for a moment before bursting into laughter. "James, are you serious? This is insane." "I know," I said, laughing along with her. My heart pounding. "I don't even know what to do with it. It doesn't feel real." Over the next few days, I started making plans. The money opened up a world I'd never even considered. I could buy my own place, maybe even travel, finally get away from the shadow of my past. But as exciting as it was, there was a strange sadness that lingered. Aunt Mary had left me everything, yet I barely knew her. I found myself wondering about her life, her choices, and why she'd chosen me to inherit her fortune. One afternoon, I decided to visit the mansion. I'd never seen it, only heard stories about the grand house where Aunt Mary had lived. When I arrived, I was struck by the sheer size of it. A sprawling estate surrounded by towering oak trees with ivy creeping up the walls. The house was beautiful, elegant yet mysterious, much like the woman who had owned it. I wandered through the rooms, each one filled with remnants of Aunt Mary's life. The furniture was tasteful, carefully selected, and the walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with novels, poetry, and memoirs. I felt a strange connection to her as I explored, as if I was piecing together the life of a woman I'd always wanted to know but had never been given the chance. In the study, I found a photograph of Aunt Mary as a young woman. She was stunning with the same confident expression I remembered from my childhood. I couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to leave everything to me, a nephew she barely knew. As I looked around the room, I felt a sudden resolve. I wanted to honor her memory, to live up to the trust she'd placed in me. In the weeks that followed, I began to settle into my new life. I bought a small condo in the city, a beautiful space filled with light, where I could finally feel at home. I quit my job at the coffee shop, though saying goodbye to Maria and my coworkers was harder than I'd expected. They'd been my family, my support system, and leaving them felt like closing a chapter of my life. But as grateful as I was, the inheritance brought complications I hadn't anticipated. News of my windfall spread quickly, and soon, people I hadn't heard from in years started reaching out. Old acquaintances, distant relatives, even high school classmates I barely remembered suddenly wanted to reconnect. It was as if the money had turned me into someone else, someone they wanted to know. Luke and Brianna too, found their way back into my life. It started with a letter from Luke, a neatly written note that arrived in the mail one evening. He didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge the years of neglect, but he wrote about how proud he was of me, how he'd always known I'd be successful. The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to rewrite history now that I had something he wanted. A few days later, Brianna showed up at my condo, unannounced. She looked the same as I remembered, tall, confident, with that same smug smile that had always grated on me. But there was a glint of desperation in her eyes, a vulnerability I'd never seen before. "James," she said, her voice smooth, too polite. "I thought we could catch up, you know? It's been a while." I looked at her incredulous. "You mean since you and your mom ignored me? Since you made it clear I wasn't part of the family?" She shifted uncomfortably, forcing a smile. "Come on, James. That was a long time ago. We're family. I just want to make sure you're okay." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger. "You didn't care about me then, and I doubt you care now. This isn't about family, Brianna. This is about the money, isn't it?" She faltered, her composure cracking for a moment. "Look, things have been tough since Mom passed. Daniela's in college, and Dad's been struggling. We could really use some help." I stared at her, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, I had the power. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the one holding the cards. But as tempting as it was to turn her away, to make her feel the rejection I'd felt, I knew it wouldn't change anything. "Brianna," I said quietly, "I don't owe you or Dad anything. You made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't part of your family. So don't pretend now." She looked at me, defeated, before nodding and leaving without another word. As I watched her go, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The inheritance had changed my life, but more importantly, it had given me the freedom to finally stand up for myself. I wasn't the scared little boy they tried to control. I was free, independent, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. It started slowly, almost like a whisper. A few random calls, a polite email from a distant cousin, and a letter or two from people I'd nearly forgotten even existed. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming these messages were just coincidence. But as the days went on, the pattern became impossible to ignore. News of my inheritance had spread through the family like wildfire. And suddenly, everyone seemed to be crawling out of the woodwork. It wasn't long before Luke reached out. He'd been oddly quiet since his last letter. The one where he tried to paint himself as the supportive father he'd never been. But this time, his tone was different. He called late one night. His voice, a strange mix of warmth and desperation. "James, sweetheart," he began as if we were close. "How have you been? I was just thinking about you, hoping everything was going well." I nearly laughed out loud at the insincerity dripping from his words, but I held my tongue playing along to see where this was going. "I'm fine, Luke. Just busy settling into everything." There was a pause, then a sigh. "James, you know, things have been a little hard for us lately. I mean, with your mother's passing and all, it's been quite the struggle." His voice cracked as if he was trying to muster up tears. I almost felt a pang of sympathy, but I reminded myself of the years I'd spent being ignored, belittled, and dismissed. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, keeping my tone flat. Luke took a deep breath, then said the words I'd been expecting but dreading. "I was thinking, with everything you've inherited, maybe you could help us out a little? You know, as a family," there it was. The family card. The one he'd never played when I was a child or a teenager or even a young adult trying to make ends meet. Now, all of a sudden, I was family. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, then replied, "Luke, I haven't been a part of that family in a long time. You made that clear when you let Rose treat me the way she did. And when you cut me out of your lives after I left." His voice tightened. A note of irritation creeping in. "That was years ago, James. We've all changed since then. You can't hold a grudge forever. Maybe not, I said calmly, but I also don't owe you anything. I built my life on my own. If you're struggling, I suggest you figure things out the way I did. The line went silent and for a moment, I thought he'd hung up. But then he spoke, his voice cold. Fine. If that's how you want to be. But don't think for a second that I'll just forget about this. We are your family, whether you like it or not. And families help each other. He hung up, leaving me sitting there, stunned and furious. His words echoed in my mind for days, eating away at the resolve I tried so hard to build. It felt like every time I took a step forward, they found a way to drag me back to remind me of the twisted loyalty they thought they deserved. But Luke was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving letters from Rose's side of the family, people I barely even remembered. An uncle named Steve, a cousin named Lisa, and a distant aunt named Karen all seemed to appear out of nowhere, each with their own sob story and plea for help. One evening, I found myself opening a letter from Karen, a woman I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The letter was long, full of flowery language and endless tales of hardship. She described how her husband had lost his job, how her children were struggling in school, how they were on the verge of losing their house. I almost felt sorry for her, but the tone of entitlement beneath her words was impossible to ignore. James, she'd written, you've been so blessed, and it would mean the world to us if you could spare just a small portion of your inheritance. We're family after all. The phrase "we're family" seemed to have become a mantra. A spell they thought would open the floodgates to my newfound wealth. But the more they pushed, the stronger my resolve became. I'd spent years scraping by, struggling to build a life for myself. Now that I'd finally found stability, they wanted to take it away, to claim a piece of it for themselves. One afternoon, just when I thought I'd seen it all, Brianna showed up unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there, looking disheveled and anxious. She'd always been so composed, so sure of herself. But now she looked almost desperate. James, she said, her voice low. I need to talk to you. I stepped aside, letting her in, though every instinct told me to keep the door shut. She walked into my living room, glancing around as if she hadn't expected me to be doing so well. It was a small victory, seeing the surprise in her eyes. Brianna, what do you want? I asked, crossing my arms. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Look, I know things haven't always been great between us. But the truth is, I need help. We all do. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. After Mom passed, things have been rough. The business she left behind isn't doing well. And with Daniela in college, it's just a lot. And Dad, well, he's not handling things well. I felt a pang of anger at the mention of Luke, but I kept my expression neutral. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, my voice calm. But I don't see how that's my responsibility. She looked at me, a mixture of frustration and disbelief on her face. James, we're family. Isn't that supposed to mean something? I stared at her, wondering how she could stand there and say that after everything I'd been through. Family, I repeated. My voice icy. You mean the family that ignored me, excluded me, and made it clear I didn't belong? The family that decided I wasn't worth anything until I had money? Brianna opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. Let me be clear, I said, my voice firm. I built this life on my own. I didn't get any help from any of you, and I don't owe you anything. You can either accept that or leave. She stared at me, a flicker of something like guilt in her eyes before finally nodding. Without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. After that, the letters and calls stopped. It was as if they'd finally realized that I wasn't going to give in, that I wasn't the scared, lonely boy they'd once known. I'd built a life for myself, one that I was proud of, and no amount of manipulation or guilt was going to take that away from me. It was as if my family was on a mission, dead set on squeezing every ounce of sympathy and dollar they could for me. After Brianna's desperate visit, the pressure only escalated. The calls and messages started again. But this time, they were less subtle, more aggressive. It was like they'd stripped away any pretense of kindness and gone straight for the jugular. Luke called almost every other day, alternating between tearful pleas and outright anger. James, how can you be so heartless? He'd sobbed. We're your family. After everything we've been through, don't you think you owe us something? It didn't stop there. My uncle Steve, who'd barely been in my life before, sent a long email accusing me of being selfish and greedy, reminding me of all the good times we'd shared when I was young. Memories that, as far as I could tell, only existed in his imagination. Each message was laced with guilt and entitlement, as if I'd somehow cheated them out of their rightful inheritance. One day, Luke showed up at my condo. I opened the door to see him standing there. His face lined with frustration and what looked like a forced sadness. I hesitated, but he pushed past me, making himself comfortable on my couch. Dad, you can't just barge in here, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked around, his eyes landing on the decor. The little touches I'd added to make the place my own. You live in such luxury, James. Do you even realize how selfish you're being? He sneered. I crossed my arms, refusing to let him get under my skin. Luxury? I live in a one-bedroom condo and work for everything I have, Luke. He sighed dramatically as if he was already exhausted. This is more than enough for one person. Meanwhile, your family is suffering. You know, Daniela's tuition isn't cheap and Brianna's struggling with the business. I interrupted him, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. And that's my responsibility. How? You made your choices, Luke. And so did Rose. You chose to push me aside to treat me like I was nothing. Now that I have something you want, I'm suddenly family? His face twisted with a mixture of anger and frustration, but he said nothing. After a moment, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. A few days later, I received a letter from a lawyer representing my family. Apparently, they were trying to stake a claim on Aunt Mary's inheritance, citing family obligation and claiming that my selfishness was causing them hardship. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. It was absurd, but it felt like a betrayal on a level I couldn't fully process. They turned to legal threats, trying to manipulate me into giving them what they felt they were entitled to. I immediately called my own attorney, Rebecca Lang, the same lawyer who'd guided me through the initial inheritance process. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who had a way of making people take her seriously. When I told her about the letter, she didn't seem surprised. James, these things happen all the time, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. People get desperate when they feel entitled to something they don't have. Let's take a closer look at their claim and see what we're dealing with. She dug into the documents they'd sent, sifting through the legal jargon and fake claims they'd cobbled together. Within days, she'd uncovered the truth. It was all a sham. The documents they'd submitted were forged, a clumsy attempt to blackmail me into giving them a share of the inheritance. They'd even gone so far as to falsify signatures and had fake financial hardships to back up their claim. Rebecca called me into her office with a triumphant smile. James, they're bluffing. Every document they submitted is either falsified or exaggerated. They have no legal standing whatsoever. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a deep simmering anger. How far were they willing to go? They lied, schemed, and tried to manipulate me. All in the name of family. I felt like I was seeing them for the first time, stripped of the masks they'd worn for years. Rebecca filed a response, shutting down their claims with a detailed counterargument that left no room for doubt. Within a week, we received notice that their lawyer had withdrawn the case, quietly retreating in the face of Rebecca's evidence. But it didn't end there. Luke was far from finished. Just when I thought things were settling down, I received another lawsuit. This time from my own father, demanding $4 million for emotional damages and lost family support. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Luke was willing to take me to court to drag my name through the mud, all for a payday. I sat across from Rebecca in her office, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. Can he actually do this? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Rebecca shook her head, a steely determination in her eyes. James, this lawsuit is baseless. He has no grounds to stand on. It's a desperate move, nothing more. We'll get it thrown out. Trust me. The court date came quickly, and though I dreaded seeing Luke again, I was ready. Rebecca had prepared me for every possible scenario, and I felt more empowered than ever. Luke sat across the courtroom, his expression cold and unwavering as if he believed he was in the right. But as Rebecca tore apart his claims, exposing the baseless accusations and lack of evidence, Luke's confidence began to waver. The judge didn't take long to reach a decision. He dismissed Luke's case with prejudice, meaning he couldn't file it again. I felt a surge of vindication as I left the courtroom, finally free of their attempts to control and manipulate me. I'd won, not just in court, but in reclaiming my life from the family that had tried to break me. In the weeks that followed, I made the decision to cut all ties with them. It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't keep letting them poison my life. I blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, and instructed Rebecca to handle any further communications. I was done with the lies, the manipulation, the endless cycle of betrayal. Instead, I turned my focus to the people who'd been there for me through everything. Sarah, Maria, and a few close friends who'd supported me without question. They'd been my rock, my family in every way that mattered. I realized that I didn't need the approval or acceptance of people who only wanted to use me.